My name is Justin Gage, and you're tuned in to the Aquarium Drunkard Transmissions podcast with your host, Jason Woodbury.
You're hearing a little of Alan Licht's cover of Van Halen. That's right, a solo guitar version of Jump. This is Transmissions, and Alan is joining us today for a discussion of his new book, Common Tones, Selected Interviews with Artists and Musicians, 1995 to 2020. Features some really incredible talks with people like ANOHNI, Greg Tate, Tony Conrad, Kelly Reichardt, Yola Tengo, and Lou Reed in an interview he seems to be enjoying. Kind of seems like Alan never rests. In addition to this fantastic book, he's part of the new Threshing Floor album, which pairs him with members of Wolf Eyes, Rebecca Odes, and Gretchen Gonzales. It was produced by L Studio 444 and Transmissions guest Warren Defever. He's an artist, writer, and curator, and we touch on all of that in this revelatory talk. I love speaking with someone who blurs the divisions between things the way Alan does. Though I was very nervous, I often get that way around people I know are much, much smarter than me, which happens often enough on this podcast. He was disarming and conversational, and this talk went places I wasn't expecting. So I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, you can help us out by sharing it. If you want to take your support a step further, you can find Aquarium Drunkard over on Patreon. All right, here we are, Alan Licht, Transmissions. I'll speak with you more on the other side. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today on Aquarium Drunkard Transmissions, Alan. What's new? What's happening? How is your Monday so far?
Well, Bandcamp Friday was Friday, and I have this. We call ourselves a talk rock trio called Title TK with Corey Archangel, who's kind of a media artist, and Howie Chen, who's a curator and does a lot of other things in the art world. And we've traditionally gone on stage and just talked about music or celebrity gossip or whatever it is we're talking about. And up until now, we haven't released any audio recordings of these concerts. We've just done transcripts, and the publisher, Primary Information, released a book of a collection of the transcripts. And then a few months ago, we released a very limited edition cassette of the last performance we did, sort of like before lockdown and everything like that, which was still quite a while before that. But it was at the Lausanne Underground Film Festival in Switzerland. And we went on quite late at night. And so the people who were still there were either drunk or insomniacs or
yeah.
So it was a pretty wild show, and it's called Metallic TK because it's sort of like the Stooges' Metallic KO, where you hear people like throwing bottles at them and all this kind of stuff, which they were actually doing with us too, where they were really getting pretty hairy. So we had a good recording of it, and we put it out as a limited edition cassette, and we've sold a bunch of them, and we're kind of down to the last copy. So Friday, I just kind of made an announcement, like, it's like now or never, like now's your last chance. So a bunch of people bought them, and so this morning I sort of I kind of boxed them up over the weekend and then mailed them out this morning.
Nice, yeah. Well, congratulations on the release of Common Tones. On the topic of cassettes, you posted recently on Twitter a bunch of cassettes of the interviews featured in this book, right?
Right.
Would you ever consider putting the audio of these talks out, or do you kind of prefer it in the book form, or maybe both?
I would, but it would take a little bit of doing because the stuff is still edited, so you would have to edit the audio recordings. And then B, because of the variations in tape speed, some of them are like really need to be kind of like speed corrected.
Yeah.
And digitized. Most of them I've never really digitized. In hindsight, it was a little bit of a mistake for me not to have gone digital and doing these recordings sooner than I have. I mean, now it's really easy for me to just do a voice memo on my phone.
Right.
Part of what made that slightly preferable was like you could buy these handheld cassette recorders that also, when you were transcribing, was easy to just like rewind just for like 10 or 15 seconds.
Right.
Which you couldn't really do on if you had a digital recorder and then transferred it to iTunes or whatever. It was a lot harder to do that. And now, of course, it's totally easy to do it.
Yeah.
With apps and stuff like that. So, and it sounds much better too. So it's like a kind of a vast improvement.
Yeah.
But for better or worse, yeah. I mean, I was still recording stuff on cassette, even a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've tried all sorts of forms too. This is obviously recording. So when we do it for the podcast, it's easy, but over the many years, I've had like tape recorders, I've had little digital recorders, I've used my phone a ton. It can be nice, especially when, like you said, you're transcribing and you just need to go back a little bit. I've even tried transcribing on lower speeds though, like half speed or whatever. And I'm like, well, maybe I could get it. And it just ended up sounding too weird to me. So I had to just like quit trying to do that. But it's I don't know.
I mean, if you're trying to figure out, like music, actually, like if you're trying to figure out someone's guitar solo or something and you play it at half speed and it's something that's really, fast, like a flurry of notes, then it can be good. But I think for spoken word, it's not so good.
Yeah.
It doesn't clarify anything if it's a word that's getting swallowed or something. It just makes, like you said, it just makes it sound worse, actually.
For sure. Well, one of the things that I found really, I really enjoyed reading through these interviews, and the first one is with Greg Tate, who is a fantastic writer. I'm curious what first drew you to his writing.
Well, I discovered it kind of simultaneously in the Village Voice and in Downbeat, because he did this fantastic. It was like a 2-part article about the Electric Miles stuff, like Miles' 70s albums, which at the time were sort of critically neglected. I think people sort of hailed Bitches Brew and maybe in a Silent Way as his kind of breakthroughs. And then the rest of the stuff in the 70s, I think critics sort of lost patience with it. But he was one of the first people to really go back and kind of explain like how groundbreaking these records were and how influential they were on people like, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, where, most critics were not really making that connection. I think Lester Bangs did because he was someone else who was a fan of those records. And then he became friends with Robert Quine, who was a guitarist in the Voidoids. And so he had that kind of personal connection where he kind of knew for a fact that was an influence there.
Yeah.
But, Greg kind of went even deeper on that. And Greg was writing about stuff like King Sunny Ade and Africa Bambaataa. And he did a great piece on Cecil Taylor in The Voice. He was just writing about really interesting stuff, and just as a writer, his use of language I thought was fantastic. It really stood out to me back then.
He's one of the things that's really interesting about him and yourself is that, and as you two discuss, you're both people who write about art but also create art and make things yourselves. I think you cite Godard and you say whether I write an essay or make a film, it's all the same. When you reflect back on conversations with people like Greg Tate and obviously the fact that this is 25 years worth of interviews and you've been playing music that entire time as well, I wonder if you find yourself thinking of the two forms, criticism and creative practice, as being more connected or less connected these days. How does it work for you?
I think the older I get, the better I'm able to analyze what the overlap is. Certainly people, at least in this country, tend to sort of like look askance if you're like trying to be a quote unquote critic and a practitioner, a musician. I mean, I've always sort of maintained that I'm more of a historian than a critic per se. I mean, I've tried not to do record reviews and things like that. And if you look at all the people in the book, they all have kind of a history to them. I'm not out there like, after, with interviewing the Strokes after their first record or something like, so what's the story, guys? Like,
sure.
Like your new band, whatever it is. So that's one thing. I've definitely, in terms of like doing improvisational music, like especially the stuff I've done with Lauren Connors, that really has a conversational element to it, where it's kind of like this, every concert is in itself a conversation. And then there's this sort of like longer ongoing musical dialogue between us that's really evolved in the same way that a conversation or a dialogue you would have with any personal acquaintance would be.
Right.
And then, just in terms of, I've always thought that kind of finding the right word or the right phrasing for something in an article or an essay is really a lot like finding the right part to play in a piece of music. Like if it's someone else's song, like coming up with the part to play for that person's song,
right,
is a lot like finding the right word to describe their practice or something if you were doing a profile of them. And the other thing about, these interviews, just kind of, and you were talking about like the recordings of the interviews, and just the whole idea of recording a conversation with somebody is, it's, like 20 years ago, I did this piece called A New York Minute, right? I don't know, do you know that piece?
I don't know that
Yeah,
piece.
It was like, there was a double CD on XI Records, which is Phil Niblock's record label. It's one of the people who's interviewed in the book. And this piece I did was where I recorded the weather forecast off 1010 Winds News Radio every day for a month. And I edited it together so that you would have that day's forecast and then what they said about the next day. And then I would cut it off there and go to the next day. So you could see how accurate the forecast was or wasn't about each day, right? And so the whole idea of recording, and then it's like, that's the first half of the piece. And then the second half is actually recorded in a subway station, which is not that far from where Phil lives in Chinatown. And it was a very busy subway station. So, if people know the subway stations in New York City now, you used to have tokens, but now you have these Metro cards. And every time you swipe it, it has like a beep. It's like, bing. And so it was a busy one. So it was almost this continuous drone of like, sort of like they're all kind of overlapping. So those are two recordings of things that otherwise don't get recorded. Nobody goes into subway stations. It's like, oh, I wish I had like recording this so I could listen back to it later.
Right.
And also just even talking with, and also the forecast. Like nobody tapes a weather report. So they can listen back to it later, even later that day, or let alone like 20 years later,
Sure.
So, but that's to me is interesting. It's like what happens when you record these things that aren't really meant to be recorded. And I think the whole interviewing process in a way is like that. It's like you're recording a conversation. Ordinarily, you don't record your conversations with your friends unless you're Andy Warhol.
Right.
But so that to me is what's part of what's interesting about it. And in doing the book with Will Oldham, Will Oldham on Bonnie Prince Billy, which was like a full length, kind of series of interviews I did over a week with him. That really part of what made that such an attractive prospect to me was like he was already a friend of mine. I knew Will even before he did music because he was friends with lots of musicians and he was a fan of my band then, Love Child, and so on and so forth. And so it was like, and I'd always had these amazing conversations with him, but of course it doesn't get recorded, it doesn't get documented. But then I thought like, wow, this is like a great opportunity to like actually, and I know other people had amazing conversations with Will too, that aren't like formal interviews, which was something he was actually sort of averse to. But I thought like this is a great way to kind of like document like what a great conversationalist this guy is, And in addition, I would never really talk to him very much about his career or about, his music, because I already had this like just this other kind of relationship to him. I wasn't like a fan or something like that. I wasn't. And we would, obviously sometimes we would kind of compare notes on music business stuff, but I wasn't going to ask him about, like, so how'd you record your latest record? Or,
how dark was the darkness in I See a Darkness or whatever? Yeah, totally.
Right.
Well, that's fascinating though. You talk about that, recording weather forecasts from 20 years ago, things like that. I getting ready for this, I listened to Today I Am a Fountain Pen, the sound installation you did, made from loops from your bar mitzvah, right?
Right.
I mean, I think about that. I think about sound as like biography in an interesting way, and how, I wonder if while this book was being assembled, I mean, did you find yourself going back and listening to any of these conversations, or were you mostly working with the printed versions that had already been, already existed?
I actually had to go back and listen to all of them because in many cases I never transcribed the whole conversation.
Sure.
In some cases I would just transcribe what the person had said, like the answers. I didn't transcribe my own questions because I was writing a profile, and
of course,
the questions were sort of irrelevant. It wasn't going to be printed as a Q&A interview, and I just didn't bother. So yeah, I did. I definitely went back and listened to everything. To go back to Today I'm a Fountain Pen, I felt like that was a little bit more about how this, like, for people who don't know, like when you do your bar mitzvah, you're reading what's called a haftorah, which is kind of a supplement to the Torah, that week's Torah reading. Mm-hmm. And the haftorah, the way you chant it, there's like this very fixed set of very short melodic phrases, and every word in it has a sort of symbol on top of it, and the symbol corresponds to the set of melodic phrases. And then, in hindsight, after becoming like a fan of minimalism, like Steve Reich and Steve Philip Glass and so on and so forth, I realized this is like exactly like that kind of approach to composing, where it's like this very fixed set of melodic things, and then they sort of like combine and recombine in different ways. And Brian Eno does that a lot too, and Terry Riley did it with some of his tape work, which in turn influenced Steve Reich's tape work. So it was about that, and then of course it was sort of funny that I actually had this recording of it. Although I think stuff like that, you do tend to document something like a bar mitzvah. We hired a photographer, and there was a photographer documenting
sure
party, so on and so forth, and it probably wasn't that uncommon to record someone's bar mitzvah. Most people probably don't keep the tape.
Yeah.
But we did, for whatever reason we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that I wonder if, as you're listening back to conversations, some of them from quite a long time ago, if you're just struck by noticing changes in maybe your own mannerisms or the tone of your voice or things like that. I mean, is there a sort of personal biography part of things as you're putting a book like this together that sort of reveals itself, or anything along those lines?
One of the things that was fun about it was having to go back and write the introductions to them. I would have to remember like what the circumstances were of doing the interview to begin with.
Right.
And then kind of remembering like all these kind of interconnections. And that's part of what the name Common Tones sort of refers to, is like how interconnected these people are, whether they realize it or not, and how interconnected I am with them, kind of even before and after the interview, just in terms of my own kind of personal history. And sometimes just, we kind of like had a social relationship before and after, or sometimes before and sometimes just after.
Sure.
So that was that part of it in terms of the personal biography for sure. Like in the interview with Ira in Georgia, there's one story I tell in there about this van kind of slowing down, and like I'm walking on the street in Hoboken, and this van kind of slows down, and someone like rolls down the window and just yells at me, "Punk," and then like speeds off after that. And that's a story I did not remember at all until I went back and listened to this transcript. And now I like vaguely remember it. I think it must have happened pretty early on after I moved there in 1990 or 91. But that story, if I hadn't mentioned that story in talking to them, I never would have remembered it.
Sure. Yeah. That was such a cool one because obviously you're talking your bands like Love Child and then Run On sort of were in similar circles with Yo La Tengo. You've mentioned the social factor a few times. Mm-hmm. When you're interviewing people who you've known for a long time or whose work you've followed for a long time or even interacted with, I mean, is there a sense of like, when you have long history with someone, does that play in sort of consciously to the kinds of questions you want to ask in terms of maybe verifying your own memories or trying to expand your sense of what a place was like or what the other people in the room might have been feeling? Is that consciously in your head, or how do you prepare for an interview with someone that you've known for a long time,
Yeah, in general, I try to avoid those kind of interviews. The thing with Iron Georgia was great because the guys who commissioned it were doing this whole, it was a special issue of this French fashion magazine actually called Purple. And the whole concept of the issue was New Jersey. And so they basically said, would you want to do a conversation with Ira in Georgia about Hoboken specifically? Yeah. And that was great because it wasn't like, it becomes awkward if you're trying to talk to them about their new album, kind of like I was saying before, talking about their new album when it's something that,
sure,
you're sort of, it's just not something you would really do, or it seems weird to sort of do it for a magazine. If I really want to ask them something about what studio they recorded them, I would just ask them if I saw them. It's like, so, and it's, again, going back again to sort of how the kind of like dual profession is perceived, people sort of look askance if it's like you're trying to sort of like play both sides of the fence. So if it's something like that, it's great if it can be something that's kind of off topic in a way, or in terms of like, so we're not like talking shop in print, we're talking about this other thing again that we have in common. Right. It's like that commonality that we have. We both lived in Hoboken for a long time. They still live. They lived there. They were there before me, and they were there after me. I think it was probably another 10 years before they moved out of Hoboken when Maxwell's closed. Right after that.
Yeah. There's so many interesting things about that idea of playing both sides of the fence or whatever. Was there ever a specific moment where you said to yourself, I'm not going to pick one of these things to do exclusively, I'm just going to do both? Or has it ever been that conscious for you?
There were people that I knew of who could kind of do that relatively successfully and relatively credibly. Mm-hmm. Lenny Kaye, I think, is a great example of that.
Sure. Yeah.
He was a great rock writer and still is. And then, with the Patti Smith group, it's like, it's pretty unassailable what he's done with Patti. And it's something where he kind of goes back and forth a little bit, when Patti was on a roll, he wasn't writing for magazines. And then when the Patti Smith group broke up, then he would go back to writing a little bit. And then, and so it was just like kind of this back and forth thing. So that to me was like a great model of how to do it. And likewise, when Love Child and was really active, I didn't do really any writing. And that's probably somewhat true of Run On too. And, then more in the, when I was doing all that stuff for the Wire, it was more the 2000s where I was, doing improv stuff at Tonic. And, again, it was like a little hairy because I was working at Tonic, doing
sure.
most of the booking. And then I was playing there. And then I was also writing for The Wire. And I was, again, like a little bit careful not to do profiles of people who would be someone I was also booking at Tonic.
Yeah.
Like I did one, it's not in the book, but I did a cover story on Michael Girard from the Swans. And Michael actually would play at Tonic quite a bit, and some of the bands on his label would play there. And he was actually kind of a great friend of Tonic's, and it was like kind of someone we really liked hosting, and we had a good rapport with him. And I had to go to, before I did it, I kind of like bounced it off Melissa Caruso Scott, who was one of the owners of Tonic, and said, like, Wire wants me to do the story, but if it's going to be weird, if you think it's going to be weird somehow,
for sure,
I can just say no. And she was like, no, I think it'll be okay.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, obviously, as somebody who, when you're talking with people who you do know well, I mean, that gives you a certain kind of leg up in terms of the kind of conversation you can have for obvious reasons, because you don't have to necessarily get all of the introductory stuff figured out. You sort of have that figured out, and I think you can go really interesting places. But at the same time, it's obvious that if it's too inside baseball or whatever, you're not going to be inviting the reader in or whatever. But I don't feel like that's the way these conversations work at all. I feel like there's so much back and forth, and I think interest, like your deep knowledge of this stuff, like in an interview. Okay, so let's say the Lou Reed interview, where Lou is like deeply into the conversation you're having. Not many writers, get that. I know you didn't know Lou Reed personally, but what kind of interactions had you had? Had you seen Lou a bunch before that conversation? I mean, obviously you followed the work, but what kind of back and forths had you experienced with him?
I mean, to go back to the first thing you were talking about, in terms of like kind of knowing someone, I think the interviews that were in Bomb magazine, which was Tony Ausler, Reese Chatham, Alessandra Navago, though I didn't know her before doing that interview. But both Reese and actually Tony, I kind of really didn't. Those are things where the point is, the whole point of Bomb magazine is to get people who already know each other to do an interview, and that kind of have it be, and with varying. So it's not like a regular interview where it's just like a journalist talking to a artist. It's like kind of two artists kind of having a conversation. And that I always thought was really cool. So I've really enjoyed doing the interviews for Bomb, kind of for that reason. I should also say that a lot of people who write for The Wire are themselves musicians.
Yeah.
And it's pretty unique in that way for a publication. And I think that's sort of what makes it kind of like a cut above the rest in terms of some of the stuff that they've published. And, one of the things I loved about The Wire was, before I started writing for it, was, they would put Iggy Pop on the cover for, whatever record he had out at the time. And they would spend like one paragraph on the record and then the rest him telling stories about the Stooges, which is what, the writer, which I'm pretty sure the writer was Edwin Pouncey, who was also Savage Pencil, the illustrator.
Right.
That's for sure what Edwin Pouncey was interested in. And it's what I think most of their readers would be interested in. So it's a great magazine just for that reason. But to go back to Lou, I was, especially in high school, I was a huge fan of the Velvet Underground. And his solo career, I sort of like followed, but with varying degrees of interest.
Sure.
But it was great timing because the record he had out then was The Raven, which was a double CD, and it was kind of all over the place. It was really kind of a labor of love. It wasn't him trying to have another hit single. It wasn't him trying to get on the radio. It was like him doing this long form thing that's inspired by those stories of Edgar Allan Poe, and he's got Ornette Coleman playing on it. He's got ANOHNI singing on it, all these kind of like guest things and it's really kind of a collaboration between him and Hal Wilner, and Wilner's input is all over it. You can see his fingerprints on it, just in kind of these weird combinations of people like the McGarrigle sisters, and also I don't know who else is even more obscure, but someone like Doug Wieselman, who was a great like clarinetist who was more in the kind of like the tonic scene and everything. So it was great. But if you go back and look at the interviews he did at that time, he's saying the exact same things about the Raven as he told me. So to a certain extent, he's got the script in mind.
Sure.
And the way I was able to get him to deviate from that again was like mentioning Metal Machine music in quad,
right?
The quad version of that, or Melody Laughter, which is like this very obscure Velvet Underground track that was really only on a bootleg for a long time. So then he's just like, whoa, wait, how do you know about all this stuff?
Yeah.
And the other thing about that article was, and even though he can see he's very complimentary to me afterwards, which was, of course, it's like extremely flattering. But what happened was that issue came out, and of course it was a cover story, and I'd written a whole article about it, and I leaned pretty heavily on that interview, but it wasn't a Q&A interview.
Right.
What happened was that there was a guy I was friendly with through Tonic, because he played there, but he also knew my music, and his name was Schooley Sverrisson. And Schooley was Laurie Anderson's musical director. And so he knew Lou through Laurie. And when that article came out, he was having a coffee with Lou out somewhere. And he was like, I just read the best article I've ever read about you. And it was this friend of mine who wrote it for The Wire. And Lou was just like, he didn't have any memory of it. He did it in a press day. And it's like, of course, he did like 20 interviews that day,
sure.
20 different magazines. He doesn't keep up with it. He doesn't care about music magazines. I mean, the thing you have to remember is Lou Reed never bought a record in his life based on a record review or based on reading an interview with somebody in a music magazine. It's like all the formative records he bought was from listening to the radio or, whatever it was. It wasn't based on the rock press. He predates any of that. So of course he was just like, yeah, whatever, the magazine, like, who cares? And Schooley was like, no, you really have to read this. Like, this is really good. And they took it, and he had it with him. He took it out of his bag. He handed it to him, and he's like, you have to read this, like, right now. I'm not talking to you anymore until you read this article.
Whoa.
And Lou starts reading, and he's like, oh my God, this is great. What is this? What is this magazine? This magazine is great. I'm getting a subscription right now. Of course, he's telling his assistant probably like, subscribe to this magazine right now, blah, blah, blah. So it was like,
yeah.
Thanks to my friend, kind of really like sitting him down and literally forcing him to read the article, that Lou was even conscious of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's
out there.
That's incredible because obviously, yeah, he's very complimentary in it, which is a cool thing, to experience. I don't care how jaded somebody would be as a music writer, if you win Lou over, that's cool. But then to have it go that much farther and have him, forget and then once again be impressed. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then later, I did an Invisible Jukebox with him for The Wire. And he totally remembered me. And he had also seen Text of Light in the interim because of we had Urish in common. And then Text of Light did something at the Kitchen. Of course, I'm sure Laurie had like a subscription to the Kitchen. I think they would go pretty much to anything at the Kitchen, but especially that they would make an extra effort to go to. And he's sort of at the end of the Invisible Jukebox, which he also was dreading, but then wound up really enjoying because I played him stuff that I knew he would like.
Yeah.
It was also sort of like flattering. I played him, again, going back to this Miles Davis 70s stuff, I played him the track He Loved Him Madly from Get Up With It, which is like this very solemn kind of funereal track that Greg had written about like brilliantly, in that downbeat piece. But I knew that Quine was a huge fan of that track, and Quine had turned Brian Eno onto it. And that in turn was a little bit of an influence on the ambient stuff, because that's one of the things about this track is it's kind of proto-ambient. And so then I was wondering if maybe Quine had played it for Lou as well. And I was reasonably confident that he had, but I didn't really know. I figured I'll play it for him and see what he thinks. But also, he had done this Metal Machine trio with Ulrich and this other guy named Sarth. I'm forgetting Sarth's last name, but and it totally reminded me of this track. And I was like, if nothing else, I'll just say like, this reminds you of anything.
Yeah.
And I played it for Lou, and he was just like, wow, listen to that guitar sound. What is it? And I was like, it's Miles Davis. He's like, this is Miles Davis? And I was like, yeah. And I was like, the reason I'm playing it is because it really sounds to me like Metal Machine Trio. And Lou said, it is so identical to it that it's frightening. Oh, and you're telling me this is Miles Davis? That's unbelievable. And of course, again, he's telling his system, like, buy this on iTunes right now. It's like,
whoa.
So that was, again, like really fantastic. And then at the end, he played me he was doing a vinyl reissue of Metal Machine music. And what he did was, and he played it for me. He was like, what do you think? And I was like, well, it's Metal Machine music. And he's like, well, but I put the quad mix in the middle. It's like the stereo mix is like left and right. Whoa. And then pan dead center is the quad mix. And the quad mix was really the Metal Machine music backwards.
Whoa.
So like, in the quad mix, it was like the two speakers in front of you were the regular one, and then the two speakers behind you were the same thing but played backwards. And so he just sort of moved it to the center. And frankly, I could not.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I love how he stayed so into like musical technology. It's like you'll see like he's kind of playing these like weird guitars, all through the solo stuff, where I say weird guitars, but I just mean like, cool high-end strange things. And he was always interested in new effects and digital sounds and all this other stuff. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, he would try to, in a lot of interviews, he would try to shift the conversation to that. And even though I think it's something he was interested in, but it was also a way to sort of like, kind of deflect from
of course,
interviewers asking him like dumb questions for the millionth time about, did you really do heroin? All this kind of stuff that he didn't want to bother with.
Right. The suicide interview is also very great in this. I recently I went back and I listened to American Supreme, and it had been a really long time since I'd heard it. And I think maybe I kind of heard it early on in my suicide discovery, and I was like, I don't really dig this, or whatever. This isn't working for me. It sounds very fascinating to me now and sounds really interesting, and it's pretty engaging. That record was one that post 9/11 you felt like it kind of captured some of the spirit. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there was a couple of tracks on there that kind of reference it somewhat indirectly, but kind of directly enough that, that's kind of where they're coming from.
Yeah.
I mean, Suicide is, while we're on the subject of technology, Suicide is a band where, with every record, they kind of improve the technology, and it can be off-putting, frankly, because, on the first Suicide record, they're basically pushing the technology as far as it can go. And that's part of what makes it cool. It's like they're trying to, like overdrive a Farfisa organ, and it's like you get this great sound that you can never get with a synthesizer. And also even the drum machine, like they're sort of like they're actually like overdriving the drum machine in the board when you could still do that with boards, and even like the echo on Alan's voice, again, they're overloading it in the board. And it's something that, when you've got when technology improves, so that you can't do that. So it's like a much cleaner sound. You're losing some of the appeal, at least for me, and probably for a lot of other people. But it's true when you go back and when you listen to this stuff and you kind of strip away and you can kind of like see past some of the production values, which also, frankly, a lot of times are like kind of arrived at with an eye towards maybe breaking them on the radio finally, and which of course is like a losing battle. when you can go back and listen to stuff like that with that in mind, then a lot of times the material underneath is still really good. And in fact, I found that with Lou also. Like there were certain things in the 80s, I tended to write off things he was doing. And when I go back and listen to it, I'm like, this is actually a great song. You just have to kind of tune out, the 80s production values where they're, again, they're just trying to make him
commercially relevant
on the radio, but it's sort of, again, like a lost cause.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. I really enjoy. You cover Suicide as well on 3 Chords and a Sword, which is up on your Bandcamp, which is incredible. I love that Van Halen cover especially. Who knew that sort of guitar solo Tacoma school style? Well, maybe not Tacoma school. I don't know how if you'd classify.
It's very much. It's supposed to be. Yeah, it's very much supposed to be in that tradition.
But I mean, it's gorgeous, and I mean, it reveals the undeniable fact, I think, that Jump is a great song. But it doesn't reveal that because it's not evident already. It's just hearing it recontextualized that way is so great. And in a way that makes me think about the contextualization and recontextualization is obviously what you do as a writer as well. So it does feel like, once again, those worlds don't seem that divided for you, and I think that that's partially what makes things great. You've long employed sort of pop references, Donna Summer or things like that, where you're taking these pop. I guess pop is the word that just keeps coming to my mind, and you're playing with it and you're juxtaposing it against these other things. So in a way that feels like you're commenting on the source material as well in its own weird way. Does it sort of feel that way to you?
Yeah, when you're covering a song, you're really in dialogue with the song. I mean, you're saying like, it's like, it's otherwise it's karaoke, right?
Yeah, sure.
It's like if you're just, and that can be okay, but it's, it's like if you're really covering it with the idea of reinterpreting it or in the case of Jump, like translating it to a different instrument, you're sort of in dialogue with the song. It's sort of like, here's what they have to say about what this song is, and here's what I have to say about what else it could be.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So, and it's also the same as if I was doing I wouldn't profile Van Halen in that way, but I mean, you could, but it is sort of like, but with the Donna Summer thing, it is in a way kind of like revisionist history, where I was like, I broke down this one, for people who don't know the piece, I broke down this one, I think it's like 4 bars of Dim All the Lights by Donna Summer. And I just looped each bar for whatever it is, like 5 minutes each. What is on the record is, like 10 seconds is all of a sudden 20 minutes.
Right.
And again, it's like with this consciousness of minimalist composition in mind, like, what happens when you kind of loop the stuff over and over where it becomes hypnotic. And there's a certain amount of disco which is meant to be, it's a funny thing. It's like hypnotic, even though it's dance music at the same time.
Yeah.
So the whole point is to keep people out on the dance floor, just kind of like boogieing down. They're not really like listening to it. It's all about the beat, just kind of like boom, 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 and your body is supposed to react to that. But I'm saying, like, what happens if you're not dancing to it? You're just like sitting there and like kind of letting it trancing out to this stuff. Like if you had been sitting, at in the Paradise Garage for an all night Larry Levan, disco mix, instead of sitting at a Terry Riley all night, flight organ concert. It's like, it's trying to approximate the same thing. So, I wouldn't write an article about Donna Summer, positing her as a minimalist composer.
Yeah.
But I would take the material and reconstruct it in a way to show this sort of like, common
tone. Yeah. The through line that connects like so much of this stuff. And it's, looking back on your work, it's clear that like you're able to isolate and sort of zone in on these shared similarities, these shared like elements that absolutely, that gets obscured sometimes when you're just listening to the regular song or whatever. So it's really interesting the way you're able to select all that. And I guess I wonder, as to sort of wind the talk down, as people are thinking a lot about genre right now, or the lack thereof, or whether or not genre is necessarily something that we need to hang on to as we move forward. I think that streaming music, for all of its issues, and there are very substantial issues with things like Spotify, and others, there is a sense that people are becoming maybe just less conditioned to necessarily decide that this belongs in this box and this belongs in this box. Do you feel like that's something that we're going, as time goes on, what's your sense of the role that genre will or won't play in the way we think about music?
Yeah, well, I think at least since the 60s, there's been all this kind of cross-pollination going on. So, a lot of the genre thing is basically marketing. It's like, subcategories.
Sure.
And then it's also kind of identification, with, certain things. Like there's, someone who's like a hardcore industrial music fan, can you call them a rock fan? I mean, do they also like Chuck Berry or something? I mean, I don't know, but probably not. Or black metal. I mean, it's amazing to me that black metal is it's fundamentally rock music, but has like no relationship to fun.
No, yeah.
All talking about burning down churches and stuff like that. I mean, in that way, I think it's sort of cool that it's like this radical sect that kind of breaks away from the church of rock and roll, which is about teenagers, in their daddy's car or whatever it is, whatever.
Right.
Whatever it was originally supposed to be, it gets so far away from that. And, the thing that's sort of amazing to me is like how malleable rock music has become as like this kind of big tent where it's like, you can kind of hybrid it with almost anything, and people have. And then, and then in turn, people start to take those hybrids and mix it with something else, the whole ECM records thing of it's like it kind of takes off from jazz, but a lot of that stuff is like, it has elements of pop, it has elements of new age, it has elements of minimalism, it has elements of all this stuff. So, it's definitely that people, I think if you're really a music fanatic, then genre, doesn't necessarily have to play too much of a role. And you can one thing will kind of lead you to something else in a genre that maybe you thought like you weren't interested in. And then all of a sudden it turns out, like folk music, for the first 10 years of buying records, I would ignore the folk section. Then once I got interested in John Fahey and stuff like that, then I would start flipping through, and it was like, you'd be surprised at what you'd find.
Yeah.
in the folk section, particularly in the late 80s. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing that kind of really relates to the book is I'm very much a product of the music press of the late 70s, which means Rolling Stone and Cream magazine. And the thing about that was you had interviews in there, not just with musicians, but also with Jean-Luc Godard or Philip K. Dick, or, I'm thinking of this guy, Jonathan Cott, who was one of the first editors of Rolling Stone. And he was there for quite a long time. Maybe he's even on the masthead somewhere now. But, he was the guy who would interview Pete Townsend, but also Godard and John Lennon and Stockhausen.
Yeah.
He has a whole book of interviews with Stockhausen. He interviewed Glenn Gould for Rolling Stone. So there was this whole kind of like, it wasn't just about rock. And that was kind of an outgrowth of the counterculture, where an FM radio, like freeform radio originally, was sort of like what happens if you play all this stuff back to back, whether it's Indian music or John Fahey or Stockhausen and this freeform thing. It's like what happens if you mix all this stuff together. And that was part of being ahead, right? It's like part of the whole deal. So a book like mine, where I'm talking to, Carl Prokoda and Tom Verlaine, these kind of like, kind of pioneering alternative guitar players, the same time as Rudy Wurlitzer and Kelly Reichardt, who are, involved in film, and Michael Stowe, who's like kind of a multidisciplinary artist, as is Corey Archangel. It's sort of like it all fits together. In my case, the common thread here is music. Like I'm basically talking to everyone as a music fan, and including Vito Acconci, who's, one of the great performance artists, but he was a huge rock fan and music fan, and most interviewers are never going to talk to him about that.
Right.
But I was talking about it, and I was saying, actually, a lot of your work seems that it's very related to that. And this was one of the few times he could say, like, yeah, a lot of the things I was doing where it's like these kind of long monologues, it's like I'm thinking about Neil Young, Last Trip to Tulsa, the sort of introspective solo singer-songwriter stuff, or Van Morrison around the same time. Or I'm thinking about Jack Nicholson in The King of Marvin Gardens. Like the first 10 minutes is just this close-up of Jack Nicholson as this late-night DJ, and he's talking about this long kind of monologue, So it's like, and again, it's the same era. It's this whole counterculture of the late 60s and 70s. So that's sort of a lot of where this is all coming from. I'm still the generation of doing that. And, and as you're talking about now, no algorithm is going to tell a Neil Young fan to check out Vito Acconci.
No way. Yeah.
Not going to happen.
We still need people to make those connections. We still need, and that's actually to close. I mean, I think about that juxtaposition, and I think about how I went back and I listened to the Evan Dando of Noise, and I don't know, listening to Lonesome Valley, where you've got this like Holler record playing and you're playing
right.
These two incongruous elements combined add up to something that's like spiritually transcendent, at least, when I listen to it. So I think that like maybe that juxtaposition, maybe what strikes us about that is the fact that these two things are individually so human and singular in their own way, and then together they make some sort of, I don't know, merged thing that's just like kind of, I don't know. I guess in its own way, it's like, yeah, that's maybe the dream of the counterculture, that a Ravi Shankar record can crash into a You're asking, Tom Verlaine about Middle Eastern scales and all of these things, and it's that, I don't know. That juxtaposition is, I think, somehow like the spark that makes music and art, so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is. In the interview with Phil Niblock, I sort of point out that, he makes these films that he shows silently, but with his music sort of being the soundtrack of people working, usually outdoors, and working with their hands for the most part. So it's sort of like manual labor. And part of the idea is like, it's sort of like a lot of this sort of labor is very repetitive. It's just like the guys just sitting there, like whatever it is they're doing, whether they're like kind of like making bread or they're working in a field somewhere or something, or whatever it is. It's like sort of this like repetitive thing. And of course, his music is very repetitive. He basically constructs it out of someone playing like one note like over and over again on their instrument, and then he kind of edits together later. But I pointed out to him that like most of the people that he's filming, are never going to see the film. They're never going to have any awareness of how it's been used. And the track you're talking about, the Lonesome Valley, is a little bit like that. It's the guy who like was competing in this hollering contest in wherever it was, South Carolina or something like that, and then was recorded, is never going to know that I then took that and then reharmonized it by playing guitar on top of it. And so there's this sort of connection there, as you're talking about, like kind of like in the greater, scheme of things, where it's not about making contact with the people like I do in this book, but it's just about making contact with human activity at large, and then giving your sort of take on it, like saying like, okay, what if and Phil too, it's like, what if I record these people doing this? No one is going to bother to film people doing this sort of work to make any kind of documentary or even for the most part, or any kind of, let alone like narrative or commercial cinema. But if I document this and then put this music to it, then it sort of becomes this like kind of hypnotic environment, and also kind of raises awareness about what the aesthetics that I'm trying to do in my music are, where that comes from in the larger world. When I did a New York Minute, part of the reason I did that was I would listen to the weather forecast every day.
Yeah.
Sometimes I listen to it multiple times a day if it seems like it's unpredictable weather. And so that was sort of an example of repetition in my own daily life. And so does that have something to do with why I like all this repetitive music, like minimalism? Maybe. I mean, there's a certain, there's some psychology at work there. I won't get too much further into psychoanalysis as to why I like that stuff, although I could.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the other thing here is like, I mean, kind of the sort of dream about the book is that somebody buys it for the Lou Reed interview and then discovers who Michael Snow is as a result, or discovers who Adris Hoyos is as a result. Or someone buys it for the Matthew Barney interview and discovers who Greg Tate is, or Ken Jacobs, or whatever it may be. The idea that once it's there, because again, to go back to these music magazines I read, they would put whoever on the whoever was a big star on the cover, and then inside would be this art. There was an article, there was an issue of Cream where Angus Young was on the cover, and inside was a whole history of the Velvet Underground. And so that's one of the ways I found out about the Velvet Underground. It's like, I mean, I think I was buying it every month anyway, no matter who was on the cover. But the point is, like, they put somebody on the cover, and then there's a kid out there that's like, that doesn't just read the article about Angus Young. You read some of the other articles in there, and that kind of starts to open all these other doors.
There's always the possibility that can happen. That's a pretty exciting thing. I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Alan, thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for this great book and all the
thanks for having me.
All the great records, and I appreciate you doing so. And hopefully we'll speak again.
Hope so.
Alan Licht here on Transmissions. I'm Jason Woodbury. I write, host, and produce the show. Andrew Horton edits our audio. Visual assets by Sarah Goldstein and Jonathan Mark Walls. And our executive producer and top of the show announcer is Justin Gage, Aquarium Drunkard main man. He founded the site in 2005 and hosts the Aquarium Drunkard Show on SiriusXM every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. California time. I appreciate you tuning in. I know there's no shortage of things that you could be listening to, so I'm very honored to have your attention. Love to hear what you're thinking of the show as well. You can find my contact info at AD. You can find me on most of the social media platforms, and Aquarium Drunkard is on Patreon if you want to make things official. Next week on the show, my conversation with writer, producer, and genuinely hilarious conversationalist Nico Case. Those who support us on Patreon have already heard this one, so if you like the idea of getting access to that stuff earlier, that's one way you can do so. All right, we'll be back soon. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Aquarium Drunkard Transmissions.